In this video, we will discuss the Civil War. Growing tensions over slavery plagued the United States in the 1850s. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 cemented the South's position in favor of secession to preserve slavery and their way of life. This bitter conflict pitted American versus American and would set the stage for a difficult reconciliation after a Union victory. Southerners saw secession as the only way to preserve slavery and the Southern way of life. Remember that after Lincoln's election, South Carolina's legislature voted to secede from the Union. Soon thereafter, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, and finally Virginia joined them. On the day after his inauguration, President Lincoln received an urgent message from Major Robert Anderson, the commander of Fort Sumter. Located in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, the fort was one of a handful of Union installations left in the Confederacy. Anderson reported that Confederates were demanding that he surrender the fort, and furthermore that his men were running low on food and ammunition. Anderson requested that Lincoln replenish the fort's supplies. This put the president in a difficult position. If he refused Anderson's request, Anderson would be forced to surrender. But if he attempted to resupply the fort, the Confederates might see the move as an act of war. Instead, Lincoln took the middle ground by supplying the fort not with ammunition, but with food for hungry men. Nonetheless, the Confederates still took this as an act of war. Take a look at the three graphs. You will notice that the North has a decided advantage in manpower, money, manufacturing, and railroads as the Civil War begins. The Union enjoyed several advantages over the Confederacy. Nearly 92% of the value of manufactured goods produced in the United States came from northern factories. With a great capacity to produce industrial goods, northern factories could easily be converted to wartime production. Also, the North had over 70% of the country's railroad lines, which aided in bringing men and material to the front lines. 7 out of every 10 Americans lived in the North. With its large population, the North could muster enough manpower to fill armed services quotas, as well as to staff its factories. Other nations recognized the U.S. government as legitimate, which meant that Congress could form treaties with foreign nations and thwart Confederate attempts to negotiate their own treaties, especially with Britain and France. Perhaps the Union's greatest non-military strength was the leadership of Abraham Lincoln. While frequently criticized and ridiculed, even by members of his own cabinet, Lincoln had an ability to keep Union morale high and maintain relations between its various political factions. The North did have some major disadvantages, however. Soldiers needed to be trained, and that took time. Fighting a war was an expensive proposition, and generating funds proved to be difficult. Fighting an offensive war in enemy territory also posed challenges. Probably the biggest problem facing the Union was its lack of skilled military leaders who could lead troops into battle and win major engagements. Though the Union had several significant advantages, the Confederacy was not without a few of its own. Since most battles took place in the South, the Confederates were fighting on familiar ground and had the support and could obtain supplies from Confederate sympathizers. Also, while Northerners differed on the reasons for fighting their Southern brothers, Confederates generally were united in their cause. The Southern states had developed a strong military tradition. Many Southern soldiers were accomplished marksmen from years of hunting. However, the most important military advantage the South enjoyed was a number of outstanding commanders, such as Robert E. Lee and Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson. These generals frequently won major battles against numerically superior forces that were often better equipped. On the other hand, the South had major impediments to victory. Though cotton profits from sales in the world market did help, the Southern economy as a whole was weak, and inflation was rampant. The South's smaller population put manpower at premium, making replacing troops lost in battle very difficult. The preoccupation with states' rights also hampered the war effort. Frequently, governors and other state authorities refused to comply with requests and orders from Richmond to provide material, manpower, and money. Similarly, President Davis was not the skilled politician that Lincoln was, and had a harder time enforcing government policy. Several Southern states had already left the Union, and had formed their own government by the time Lincoln took office. In his inaugural address, delivered in the shadow of the as yet unfinished Capitol dome, Lincoln tried to reassure Southerners that he did not intend to abolish slavery, and that it was in the hands of the Southern states whether a civil war would ensue. In his speech, Lincoln stated, quote, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." End quote. He also said, quote, "I take the official oath today with no mental reservations, and with no purpose to construe the Constitution or laws by any hypercritical rules. And while I do not choose now to specify particular acts of Congress as proper to be enforced, I do suggest that it will be much safer for all, both in official and private stations, to conform to and abide by all those acts which stand unrepealed, than to violate any of them, trusting to find impunity in having them held to be unconstitutional." However, on September 22, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that as of January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in the states currently engaged in rebellion against the Union shall be thenceforward and forever free. Lincoln didn't free any of the approximately 4 million men, women, and children held in slavery in the United States when he signed the formal Emancipation Proclamation the following January. The document applied only to enslaved people in the Confederacy, and not to those in the border states that remain loyal to the Union. Although it was presented chiefly as a military measure, the proclamation marked a crucial shift in Lincoln's views on slavery. Emancipation would redefine the Civil War, turning it from a struggle to preserve the Union to one focused on ending slavery, and set a decisive course for how the nation would be reshaped after that historic conflict. The Southern government was a confederacy formed by a constitution very similar to that of the United States. Jefferson Davis was its president. His term was supposed to be 6 years. The Confederate States of America ran into many problems in its short run. First, state governors were constantly battling Davis about states' rights, especially when it came to mandatory military service. Davis also had his authority challenged on numerous occasions. Second, the Confederacy had economic troubles. The Confederacy could not keep up with the production boom in the North and couldn't overcome export problems. This was compounded by infrastructure problems, including bank failures from a lack of a stable currency. Next, let's discuss the economic effects of the Civil War on the South. First, the war devastated plantation agriculture, especially following the Emancipation Proclamation. Southern plantations were unable to continue production when they lost their labor. Overall production dropped by 33%. Next, widespread shortages throughout the Confederacy led to food riots, hoarding of goods, and the creation of a black market for hard-to-find supplies. Also, the war led to a shortage in the number of available doctors, as many had been conscripted into the military to tend to the wounded. Craftsmen were also hard to find, as many of them died in the war. Finally, inflation was a major issue caused by the instability of the Confederate dollar and the influx of paper money printed by the Confederate government to try to keep the economy going. The Civil War had a significant impact on Southern society. As most of the men were off fighting the war, women had to stay home and attempt to run the plantations to maintain its agricultural production. Women also had to replace men in several new fields, including nursing. They also cooked meals and sewed uniforms for the soldiers. As for slaves, they were freed thanks to the Emancipation Proclamation. Many slaves would leave their plantation and move to the North, where they joined the military and fought for the Union. Some slaves, however, decided to stay with their families, but resisted the authority of their former masters. Union commanders quickly developed a strategy for subduing the Confederate States. Proposed by General Winfield Scott, it became popularly known as the Anaconda Plan, in reference to the snake that suffocates its prey by squeezing. The strategy consisted of two parts. First, the Union Navy would blockade southern ports in order to keep imported goods from landing on Confederate shores. The second part involved the Union Army seizing control of the Mississippi River to split the Confederacy in two. Union forces would then advance to capture Richmond, Virginia, the new capital of the Confederacy, which had been moved from Montgomery when Virginia seceded. The Confederate strategy was primarily defensive. If the Confederate army was in the field, it served as a symbol of Southern resistance. However, Confederate commanders did have the option to attack Union armies and even invade Union territory, should it be advantageous to do so. If the Union was going to win, Lincoln would have to keep the border states in the Union. Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland all stayed in the Union, despite being slave states. This was crucial to victory. Second, the Union had to keep Britain and France out of the war. Any European alliance with the South could spell doom for the Union. How was Lincoln able to achieve these goals? Unfortunately for the South, King Cotton did not have the power to dictate foreign policy. Britain was able to get cotton from Egypt and India. They also substituted other materials for textiles. Also, the Confederate loss at Antietam kept the British government from recognizing the Southern government. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation kept the border states in the Union by only freeing slaves in the Confederacy, and it garnered support from the working class in Britain who were anti-slavery. The Battle of Bull Run in 1861 was the first major battle of the war. 30,000 Federal troops attacked the Confederacy. The Union appeared to be winning until General Stonewall Jackson counterattacked and sent the inexperienced Union troops fleeing back to Washington, D.C. The significance of the battle was that it ended the illusion of a short war and promoted the myth that the rebels were invincible in battle. The battle in Shiloh in 1862 was a devastating battle in the West. Union General Ulysses S. Grant was trying to cut the Confederacy in half when Confederate forces under Albert Johnson launched a surprise attack in this western Tennessee town. Grant was able finally to recover, but both at great losses to both sides, more than 23,000 dead or wounded. The Battle of Antietam in 1862 was an important one. Confederate General Robert E. Lee invaded Maryland, hoping a major victory would convince Britain to give official recognition and support to the Confederacy. McClellan had been restored as general. He knew of Lee's plans because a Confederate soldier had dropped it. It was the bloodiest single day of combat in the entire war. 22,000 were either killed or injured. It was a decisive battle because it stopped the South from gaining recognition from a foreign power. While technically a draw, it was a Union victory and convinced Lincoln to announce his plans for the Emancipation Proclamation. The Battle of Vicksburg in 1863 is considered a turning point in the Western theater of the Civil War. Union General Ulysses S. Grant began a siege of the last holdout, heavily fortified city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Union artillery bombarded the city for 7 weeks before Confederates finally surrendered, over 29,000 soldiers. Federal warships now control the length of the Mississippi River, cutting off Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas from the rest of the Confederacy. The Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 is considered the turning point in the East. Confederate General Robert E. Lee invaded the North again, hoping to defeat Union forces and capture a major Union city, forcing the North to sue for peace. It would also gain foreign intervention on the South's behalf. Lee surprised Union forces in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It was the bloodiest battle of the war with over 50,000 casualties. Confederate General George Pickett led an unsuccessful charge against Union forces that destroyed a key part of the Confederate Army. Lee was forced to retreat to Virginia. The significance of the battle was that the South could never invade the North again. The rest of the fighting would occur in the South, and no foreign power would come to the South's aid. On November 19, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln delivered remarks, which later became known as the Gettysburg Address, at the official dedication ceremony for the National Cemetery of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. Though he was not the featured speaker of the day, Lincoln's brief address would be remembered as one of the most important speeches in American history. In it, he invoked the principles of human equality contained in the Declaration of Independence and connected the sacrifices of the Civil War with the desire for a new birth of freedom, as well as the all-important preservation of the Union created in 1776 and its ideal of self-government. The Battle of Atlanta in 1864 began when Union General Tecumseh Sherman marched into the city, burning it to the ground just in time to help Lincoln get reelected. He would march onto Savannah on the coast and up to Columbia, South Carolina, burning the capital that led the move to secession to the ground. The significance is that Sherman's march broke the spirit of the Confederacy and destroyed its will to fight on. The Battle of Richmond in 1865 began as the Confederacy sued for peace, but Lincoln would accept nothing short of restoration of the Union. The Union Army forced Lee to retreat from Richmond with less than 30,000 men. He tried to escape to the mountains but was cut off by General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. Grant treated Lee with respect, allowing his men to return to their homes with their horses after the official surrender. The Civil War was over.